Hello, everyone. We are back again here working through the book of 1 Corinthians, one big idea at a time. I'm enjoying it. Really love getting to sit down and do this with all of you. If this content is valuable to you, if there's some value in it that you find and it blesses you, would you consider sharing it with somebody else that you think it might also benefit? Whether it's sending a text with an episode saying, hey, check this out, you might like this, or there's something here you might consider, or sharing one of our updates on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or anything like that. All of these things help to move us along. Basically, if there's a button you can hit where you're at, so like, subscribe, share, whatever, comment, do that. That helps us. The only button you shouldn't be hitting is the unsubscribe button. Put a big, safety switch on that so you don't touch that one. But the rest of them, please hit those and help us out with that. Today we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 through 4. Does any one of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you not competent to form the smallest law courts? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more matters of this life? So if you have law courts dealing with matters of this life, do you appoint them as judges who are of no account in the church? Today we're getting into chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians, and I'm excited because this is a really different situation. Recall chapters 1 through 4 serve as an introduction. These chapters address the heart of the problem in Corinth and the antidote to it. In particular, they've lost hold on the power of the gospel. The gospel is meant to oppose the strong, the wise, the noble of this world. In that, it turns the definition of power and wisdom and greatness on its head. The cross demonstrates that the thoughts of the world are bankrupt in finding true meaning, life, happiness, and human flourishing. However, the way that the gospel disarms these conceptions of reality is offensive to those who it renders weak, foolish, and insignificant, and so they reject it. Because acceptance of the gospel means a rejection of what they've built their identity around, they don't want to do it. Unfortunately, the Corinthians sort of get caught in the crossfire here, where there are some who've tried to inflate their self-importance through these mediums of power, of greatness, of money, of wisdom, and things like this. And so the church became about a political structure and rallying around certain types of teachers rather than trying to exalt Christ, because they hit a crossroads here. They hit some point where they can't go any further with these various ideas and with the cross. So you got to take one or the other, and they reject Christ instead. Paul plainly declares that because of this, they are carnal and not spiritual. While he spends some time straightening out their idea and understanding of roles in a role of teachers in God's purposes, Paul's primary focus is to get them to realize that in their arrogance, they are trading the riches of God in Christ Jesus through the gospel for scraps. In chapter 5, he showed how the gospel demanded purity and how they must deal with the problems in the church. Today, he's going to talk about relationships with others, specifically as it pertains to disputes and legal disputes. Now, I want to quickly say before we get into our big idea, this is not intended as legal advice. I'm not a lawyer. My initials are JD, but I don't have a JD, as I like to say. This is just expositing what Paul says from the Word and trying to draw the implications as Christians. And so this is not meant to be construed as legal advice. This is informational and informative and spiritual in that way. So let's make sure we get that context there. Today, our big idea is don't go to court with believers. Don't go to court with believers. To understand that, we want to look at number 1, choose saints over the unrighteous. Number 2, the saints will judge. And 3, let the church do its job. So choose saints over the unrighteous, saints will judge, and let the church do its job. Saints, judge, and church will be those ideas that we kind of hit down through here. Paul begins with a hypothetical framework that frames our big idea for the day, which is when you have a case against a neighbor, do you dare to go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? And Paul's going to criticize them for this. The rhetorical answer is yes, and the way he's kind of shaping this is that he can't believe they're doing this. It's almost like he's asking the question, like, seriously? Is this what we're doing? Now, the word neighbor in verse number 1 is somewhat ambiguous because a neighbor can refer to anyone in near proximity. However, Paul's not so concerned about ending up in court with a non-believer and how that would work, though some of the wisdom may apply to those situations and how we try to handle that. Rather, Paul's focus is on bringing legal disputes between the saints before courts of the unrighteous. The saints before the world, and having the world judge the saints is problematic. Now, this is logically obvious that this is his focus because an unrighteous person doesn't view the church as a credible judge. And especially, if you've got someone who is outside the world and somebody inside the church, or somebody out in the world and in the church, and the person in the church wants to bring the person in the world into the church to let them judge, like this just doesn't work. They're not going to accept that judgment. So that's just on the logical level why he's not talking about that. This is not saying that Christians can't be involved in legal disputes with people outside the church. But more importantly than just the logical side, from the text we'll read next time, Paul chastises them for taking Christians and brothers and sisters to court before unbelievers. So it's the problem here is they're taking their fellow church members to court with unbelievers. Reconstruct the situation. It appears there was some sort of property dispute. Could have been physical property, like we think about real estate, animals. Could have been goods, money, labor, injury. Things happen. These sort of things happen amongst people where there's some disagreement about what's just, what's fair, who gets what. Christians getting fender benders in the church parking lot. It happens. People have church members mow their grass and a rock goes through the window. These sort of things just happen. The fact that there's a disagreement and that there's frustration and there's difficulty and about what's deserved and who's right doesn't inherently indicate things are broken. Just motion creates friction. Motion creates friction. And so occasionally there's going to be these sorts of things that we have to deal with. And part of his point here that they'll just say is the body's equipped to handle this. But the dysfunction in this church had reached a level that instead of trying to talk this out, work this out, and submit to what the members say, somebody will just file a lawsuit with the other one. We've already seen that wealth and the preference for wealth is an issue in this, and that'll be more obvious in chapter 11, and especially we'll kind of get into next time. It seems that perhaps the wealthy may have been leveraging the fact that they could go to court and win to exploit people. We can get the lawyers, we know the people who are city managers, we know the judges, they'll like us and they'll rule in our favor even if it's not unjust. That seems to be what's going on here. At the very least, covetousness and greed are at the source of this problem, even if it wasn't centralized in the affluent. So even if you got people who are, poor or middle class doing it, it seems obvious there's a greed issue at the heart of this. All right, second point. Paul gives a couple of proofs as to why they shouldn't be doing this and why the saints are the most qualified to make a judgment in these matters. He rhetorically asks, don't you know that the saints will judge the world? And then he more shockingly asks, don't you know that we will judge angels? To which we might reply, nope. Sure don't know that. It would be great if you could expand. When Paul uses that phrase, though, do you not know, his purpose is to call to mind something they've been foolish to forget. And this is a bit of a mystery because it doesn't seem to be a super obvious teaching. This could have been something that he said while he was there and taught in Corinth, or was something that was spoken by various people that got around that we don't necessarily have too explicitly in the records today. And what's interesting is he says this, do you not know that we'll judge the world and we'll judge angels? This is probably the most obvious place where it happens. To give you a little bit of idea what's going on here, why is this so obvious that Paul would just assume they knew that? The clearest Old Testament passage is probably Psalm 149, which says that the godly ones will execute judgment on the saints. In that case, it seems that along with the Messiah or the Messianic hope there, that along with that, the holy ones of God would be a part of bringing righteousness in that situation. The New Testament, we have the apostles judging the 12 tribes of Israel, but part of what's here is strange is in John 5, it says that all judgment's been given to the Son. So it's been suggested by some that the word for judge more generally means to rule, which implies the judgment associated with that. So let me help you here. In our modern world, we usually divorce the judicial and executive functions of government, especially in America. We do that explicitly. In America, we've got this executive branch and a legislative branch and a judicial branch, and these are all separate. Whereas in this day, you kind of got the magistrate and they're judge, jury, and executioner. They've got the whole ability to do anything they want to. And so in this case, the rulership and the right to make judgments in cases in what we call criminal or civil there, that's left to one person. So those being knit together is Makes a lot of sense. And so some assert that Paul is bootstrapping the notion of the saints ruling with the Messiah, which is a very prevalent theme. The saints ruling with the Messiah, that's all over the place. And he's kind of pulling off the judicial component that comes with the ruling. So you got this whole package in the Old Testament of the saints, the holy ones, the people of God ruling alongside the Messiah, and that occurs other places in the New Testament too. And then he's pulling off the component of that is the judicial part, which makes this now obvious, and that feels right to me. In terms of dealing with the idea that authority has been given to the Son to judge, I would suggest that when the saints are raised incorruptible, they'll be transformed to completely adopt the will of Christ. And in that case, any judgment that we would offer will completely adhere to the judgment of Christ because it'll be glorified in its perfection. And so as the saints today are being refit for the image of Christ, and we're being conformed to be like Jesus, it means we're fit to make judgments today. Right, so with some understanding of how that's possible, potentially, we'll look at what it means and how Paul applies it in this situation. So Paul's reminded them, we'll say that the saints will participate with Christ in the judgment of the world and of Satan. This is the highest stakes judgment that will ever take place, the decision of eternal destiny. God has made it such that saints will be fit to rightly adjudicate those judgments. And then Paul argues from the greater to the lesser to say that saints can handle trivial suits. The NASB has the phrase smallest courts of law, and that literal translation there, it means small matters. And that means that Paul is, in some sense, quite frankly, dismissing the significance of what they think is important enough to sue over. We've got this idea of a mess with it cost that isn't worth messing with. And what Paul's saying is these things that you're suing over are not important enough to actually mess with and to deal with. Regardless, just like someone who's a professional appellate judge with decades of experience would be more than able to handle traffic court, spiritually minded saints are equipped to handle the matters that the Corinthians need decided. Instead, the Corinthians are setting up those who are of no regard in the church as the authority. In some sense, they have unnecessarily invited the world to rule the church, which talk about how there's no hold barred when we lose hold of the gospel. We talk about that, right? That whenever we slip of the gospel, Christians could do anything. But if we allow people who aren't just immature but enemies of Christianity to have an affair or a say in the affair of the saints, there's no telling what could happen. I know of one saint that ignored this passage to the pleading of their fellow Christians, and they got their head handed to them. We need and should want people with spiritual wisdom and spiritual mindset and spiritual priorities to help us sort through grievances. Leaving that open to the world is asking for trouble, or perhaps it's a desire to do to win over what's right by God and neighbor. So we're asking for trouble, and we're showing we prefer our will to the purposes of God, which we'll talk a good bit about more next time. So we've got this instruction with the Corinthians not to go to court with fellow saints. Perhaps there are more glaring issues within the church, such as what we read about in chapter 5, or their association with idolatry in chapter 8 through 10, and some of the assembly situations. And perhaps there are deeper theological issues, like we say, around the assembly or the resurrection. But to me, this just shows the brokenness of the relationships in the situation of the church, that the people here don't trust the community enough to look out for each other and to look out for them. And instead, this skepticism around the church's ability to treat people fairly, or a desire to just circumvent justice, are perhaps some of the ways in which this community is just broken, the lack of love that they have for one another. We'll try to think more about the parallels to our current situation more, and as I dove into this, and worked in this text and the back half of this text, there's so many questions and how this interfaces with our current legal system and where we're at and how we do this and what we can and can't do and what this passage is saying and isn't saying, that I think will ask us some questions in the Q&R. I'd love to really unpack this. We need to take this warning seriously. And I want to be clear, the warning here is about taking Christians to court in civil matters. All right? Taking Christians to court in civil matters. That doesn't mean you shouldn't answer court summons if they come. It certainly doesn't mean if there's criminal things that happen within the church that there shouldn't be the necessary legal things going on there. This is about civil suits between people. If someone commits a crime that's a Christian, we don't have to try to cover it up to do this passage. Certainly not. In that case, they've sinned against the people or the society at large, and that's kind of how that's formulated. That's not what this is about. This is about specifically suing fellow Christians without trying to enter into some sort of mediation with the church and submitting to that judgment. Right. Moreover, we need to examine the attitudes of pride, though, because this just feels so far off. But we need to examine the attitudes and behaviors that could lead to this, attitudes of pride, entitlement, and suspicion. So as we ask some questions here, because this may feel really far off, but we need to ask, what would cause this to happen, and how can we keep that from happening? So do you trust your church community to handle a dispute between you and a fellow Christian? Do you have the relationships with them and with others to handle it with your fellow Christians before it escalates? If something petty happens, broken window, fender bender, can you deal with that? Are you fostering relationships of mutual love, care, and sacrifice? Are you currently pursuing unity, openness, oneness, and trust so that you have a foundation if anything does arise? You think about the idea of a dispute with a fellow member. Is there someone at church that the idea of disputing with them gets you frustrated? It gets you angry? That it gets under your skin right now? That your blood begins to boil a little bit about the idea of like having to try and settle something with them? Do you need to start investing in building that relationship today? Do you need to start investing in loving them now so that if, God forbid, something does happen, that your lack of care and keeping them at arm's length won't cause future harm to the body? Are you investing in future stability, or are you undermining future peace? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: don't go to court with believers.